No one is supposed to hear a dog digging at midnight in a military cemetery, especially when the only witness is a man who has already buried too many memories to trust what he sees. The wind moved low across the grounds of Arlington Ridge Memorial Park just outside Fort Worth, Texas, carrying the dry scent of cut grass and distant rain that never quite arrived. Street lights along the perimeter road flickered like tired sentinels, casting pale circles over rows of identical white stones that stretched into darkness. Somewhere beyond the iron gate, a lone figure stood still, watching the impossible. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker did not move at first. He had the posture of a man who had learned to pause before reacting, as if every second of hesitation kept something fragile from breaking. At his side, a German shepherd named Rex dug into the earth with a focus that did not belong to instinct alone. It was precise, deliberate, almost as if he was following instructions no human could hear. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool 52-degree air, and stepped closer, boots pressing softly into the damp soil. Rex did not look back. His amber eyes were locked on the ground, ears tight, muscles shifting with a controlled urgency that Ethan recognized from years ago in a different world, a different war. "Rex," Ethan said quietly, his voice firm but not harsh. "Easy, buddy." The dog paused for half a second, just long enough for hope to flicker, then resumed digging with renewed intensity. Dirt scattered against the edges of a weathered headstone marked simply as unknown, a stone that had always been there but never asked questions. Ethan crouched slowly, gloved hand brushing over Rex's shoulder. The fur was warm, familiar, grounding him in a reality he was struggling to define. "What are you trying to tell me?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer was not something spoken. Behind them, the cemetery remained still, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A faint rustle came from the tree line, just beyond the lantern glow, but when Ethan turned, there was nothing there except wind moving through cedar branches. He turned back to Rex. The dog let out a low, steady sound, not a bark, not a whine, something deeper, like memory trying to surface through instinct. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Rex had not behaved like this since their final deployment together 3 years ago, before the mission ended abruptly and the unit was reassigned, before paperwork replaced certainty and silence replaced answers. The military had called it closure. Rex clearly disagreed. Ethan stood again, scanning the rows of graves. Each one represented a name, a story, a final confirmation. But this one, the one Rex was destroying the ground over, had no confirmation at all. Just a marker. Just absence. The wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic scent of old soil, and for a moment Ethan thought he heard something beneath it, something that did not belong to the present. Rex suddenly stopped digging. His body went rigid, head tilted slightly toward the earth, as if listening. Ethan felt it too then, that strange pressure in the air that made the world feel too quiet, too aware of itself. He knelt down again, slower this time, and placed his hand near the disturbed soil. "You remember something," he said softly, more to himself than to the dog. Rex did not move, but his eyes stayed fixed on the ground with unwavering certainty, as if the answer was already there, just waiting to be uncovered. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the soil. He had learned long ago that dogs did not dig without reason, not like this, not with this kind of focus. Somewhere beneath the earth, something waited that should not have been forgotten. And for the first time that night, Ethan Walker wondered if the past he thought was buried had actually been watching him all along. The silence that followed felt heavier than sound itself as Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained kneeling beside the disturbed soil, his hand hovering just inches above the ground, while Rex continued to hold his position like a statue carved from instinct and memory. The cemetery lights flickered again, casting uneven shadows across the rows of headstones. And for a brief moment Ethan felt as if the entire place had shifted slightly out of time. Like reality itself had tilted towards something buried and long ignored. He slowly reached into his jacket and pressed the small radio clipped inside, hesitating before speaking in a low, controlled voice, requesting the cemetery groundskeeper to come to Section 7 without raising unnecessary concern. Rex did not react to the words, only adjusted his stance and lowered his head again toward the soil, as if confirming that the answer was still there and still within reach. Within minutes, footsteps approached along the gravel path, measured and cautious, and a man in his late 50s carrying a small flashlight appeared at the edge of the lantern glow. His name tag identified him as Daniel Harper, caretaker of Arlington Ridge Memorial Park for over 20 years, a man who had seen grief in all its quiet forms, yet still carried himself with steady patience. Daniel stopped when he saw the disturbed ground and the German shepherd, his expression tightening with immediate recognition of concern rather than surprise. "Sergeant Walker," Daniel said carefully, his voice respectful but uneasy, "that area is not part of active maintenance rotation." Ethan rose slowly, keeping his movements calm. "I know," he replied, glancing briefly at Rex before continuing, "but he will not stop. Something is here." Daniel shifted his flashlight beam toward the ground, illuminating the uneven soil where Rex had been digging. For a moment, there was only skepticism in his eyes, the kind that came from routine and rules rather than emotion. But then Rex let out a low, steady sound again, and Daniel's expression changed subtly, as if something in the tone bypassed logic entirely. The groundskeeper stepped closer, kneeling carefully at the edge of the disturbed earth, brushing away loose dirt with gloved fingers. "This section," he murmured, almost to himself, "this was cleared years ago after a record discrepancy." Ethan looked down sharply. "What kind of discrepancy?" Daniel hesitated before answering, his flashlight pausing on a small fragment of material half exposed beneath the soil, something metallic catching just enough light to reflect faintly back. "A transfer that was never fully documented," he said quietly. "A service member listed in transit but never accounted for at final assignment." The file was closed without resolution. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but recognition of unfinished business. Rex suddenly stepped forward again, nudging the soil with deliberate precision until the metallic object became more visible, revealing the edge of what looked like an old military identification container, worn by time and pressure from the earth above it. Ethan crouched instantly, carefully brushing away more soil with both hands now, his focus absolute, as the night air seemed to grow stiller with each movement. Daniel stood frozen, watching in silence as Rex remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed not on the object itself, but on Ethan, as if waiting for him to understand what could not be spoken. Ethan finally grasped the edge of the container and pulled it free with steady caution, revealing a weathered piece of military equipment marked with faded insignia that did not immediately match any current active record. He turned it slowly in his hands, scanning the surface under the dim light, his expression shifting as fragments of memory surfaced from years earlier, fragments of a mission he had tried not to revisit. Rex stepped closer and placed his head gently against Ethan's arm, a gesture so subtle it carried more meaning than any command ever could. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, breathing deeply as if trying to align what he was seeing with what he remembered, and when he opened them again, his voice was quieter than before. "This was not supposed to be here," he said, more to himself than anyone else, while Daniel stepped back slightly, uncertainty replacing certainty in his posture. The cemetery no longer felt like a place of rest, but like a place waiting for acknowledgement, and as Ethan looked once more at Rex, he realized this was not random instinct or confusion. It was recognition, and somewhere beneath the weight of forgotten records and buried time, something that had been sealed away was beginning to surface again. The moment the metallic container emerged fully from the soil, the atmosphere around Arlington Ridge Memorial Park shifted in a way that felt almost imperceptible yet undeniable, as if the air itself had become heavier with unanswered questions. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker held the object carefully in both hands, turning it slowly under the dim beam of Daniel Harper's flashlight, his eyes scanning every worn edge and faded marking as fragments of memory began to surface in uneven pieces. Rex remained close, unmoving now, but alert in a way that suggested the search was not over, only paused. Daniel stepped back slightly, his voice lower than before as he tried to process what they were seeing. "That container should not be here," he said quietly, glancing between Ethan and the disturbed soil. "That design was decommissioned more than 10 years ago." Ethan did not respond immediately. His attention was fixed on a faint engraving along the side of the metal, barely visible beneath layers of oxidation, but familiar enough to tighten something deep in his expression. He exhaled slowly and stood, holding the object closer to the light. "I have seen this before," he said at last, his tone controlled but distant, as if speaking through memory rather than present time. Rex shifted slightly, stepping forward until he was directly beside Ethan, his shoulder brushing against the sergeant's leg in a grounding gesture that carried quiet urgency. Daniel leaned in cautiously, trying to get a better look, but stopped when Ethan raised one hand slightly, signaling him to wait. The silence that followed was not empty, but dense, filled with the weight of something unresolved. Ethan's thoughts drifted back several years, to a mission that had ended without full clarity, only fragments reported and later sealed behind classified reports. He remembered a convoy, an extraction point, and a final transmission that had cut off abruptly before confirmation ever arrived. At the time, the official report had closed the matter as incomplete recovery due to environmental conditions, but what he was holding now suggested something far more deliberate had been left behind. Rex suddenly lifted his head again, turning slightly toward the surrounding graves as if tracking something invisible, then returned his focus to the disturbed earth. Without hesitation, he moved forward and resumed digging, this time slower but even more precise, as though following a trail beneath the surface rather than reacting randomly. Ethan watched him closely, his grip tightening around the container as understanding began to form in uneasy layers. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice cautious. "Sergeant, if there is something buried here that was not recorded properly, this could involve military oversight beyond my authority." Ethan nodded slightly, still not looking away from Rex. "I am aware," he replied. "But this is not just paperwork." Rex paused again, then pushed deeper into the softened soil until a second object became visible, smaller this time, wrapped in deteriorated protective material that had once been sealed against time. Ethan knelt immediately, carefully clearing the surrounding dirt with deliberate movements, his focus narrowing completely as the world beyond the grave seemed to fade. Daniel stood silently now, no longer questioning, only observing. When Ethan finally uncovered the second item, he paused, studying it for a long moment before carefully lifting it free. It was an identification patch, weathered but still partially readable, bearing markings that should have matched a known personnel record, yet something about it did not align with any file he remembered. Rex stopped digging and simply watched Ethan, his breathing steady, his presence unwavering, as if confirming that the final piece had been found. Ethan looked down at the patch, then back at the container in his hands, and for the first time since arriving, his expression shifted into something closer to realization than confusion. "This was not an accident," he said quietly, almost beneath his breath. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke with careful precision. "Someone made sure this was never properly recorded." The words hung in the air between them, carried by the stillness of the cemetery. Rex stepped closer again, pressing his head lightly against Ethan's arm, and in that simple gesture there was no uncertainty, only certainty that the truth had not been lost, only buried. Ethan looked out across the rows of graves, the weight of what he was beginning to understand settling deeper with each passing second, and for the first time, he understood that Rex had not brought him here to remember the past. He had brought him here to uncover what someone had tried to erase. The air around Arlington Ridge Memorial Park felt noticeably different now, as if the discovery beneath the soil had altered something deeper than just the physical ground. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker stood still for a moment, holding both the weathered container and the recovered identification patch as if they carried weight far beyond their material form. Rex remained close, no longer digging, but fully attentive, his amber eyes shifting between Ethan and the disturbed grave with a steady focus that suggested completion was not yet certain. Daniel Harper took a cautious step back, his flashlight lowering slightly as uncertainty replaced his earlier confidence. "I have worked this cemetery for over 20 years, he said quietly, "and I have never seen anything like this tied to a burial record." Ethan did not respond immediately. His attention was now fully locked on the identification patch, carefully examining the faded letters and partial insignia. Something about it did not align with the known roster of his former unit. Yet the familiarity of the design triggered fragments of memory that refused to settle into a clear picture. He slowly stood upright, exhaling through his nose, his voice calm but firm when he finally spoke. This does not match any official documentation I remember from that deployment cycle. Rex shifted slightly closer again, pressing his shoulder against Ethan's leg in a quiet gesture that seemed almost intentional, as if reinforcing the importance of what had just been uncovered. Daniel glanced between them, then down at the exposed soil. If there was an unrecorded transfer, he said carefully, then someone would have had to authorize a full administrative override. That is not something that happens by mistake. Ethan nodded once, absorbing the implication without interruption. The cemetery around them remained still, but the weight of the moment made it feel as if the entire space had narrowed to this single point of uncertainty. He crouched again and gently placed the recovered items on a flat stone near the grave marker, then turned his attention back to Rex. "You knew," Ethan said quietly, not as a question but as recognition. Rex did not respond in any human sense, but his posture changed slightly, as if acknowledging that the task was not yet finished. Daniel moved closer again, now more focused than cautious. "Sergeant Walker, I need to ask something," he said. "Do you believe this animal is reacting to something specific, or could this be residual training behavior?" Ethan considered the question for a moment before shaking his head slowly. "This is not training," he replied. "Rex has been with me through multiple deployments. He does not react like this without reason." Rex suddenly turned his head toward a different section of the cemetery, ears lifting sharply as if catching a signal that neither Ethan nor Daniel could perceive. Without hesitation, he moved forward several feet and stopped at another unmarked patch of ground, lower in elevation, partially concealed by overgrown grass and uneven terrain. Ethan followed immediately, his steps more deliberate now, his attention narrowing as the pattern began to reveal itself. Daniel hesitated for a second before following, his flashlight beam sweeping across the new location. "That section was never formally assigned a marker," he said slowly. "It was left untouched after an administrative review was closed." Ethan knelt again beside Rex, his eyes scanning the ground carefully. "Closed without resolution," he repeated under his breath, as if connecting fragments of an incomplete puzzle. Rex began to paw at the soil again, but this time more gently, almost methodically, as if indicating rather than digging. Ethan placed his hand on the ground and felt a subtle difference in resistance, as if something beneath the surface disrupted the natural composition of the earth. He looked up briefly at Daniel. "There is more here," he said simply. Daniel exhaled, uncertainty now fully replaced by concern. "If there is more than one site involved," he replied, "then this may extend beyond a single incident." Rex let out a low, steady sound again, then stepped back slightly, waiting. Ethan looked at him, then at the ground, and finally at the surrounding rows of graves that stretched into the distance like silent witnesses. For the first time since arriving, he understood that this was not isolated. It was structured, and Rex had not simply found something lost. He had found the edge of something that had been carefully hidden. The realization that the disturbance extended beyond a single burial site changed the atmosphere around Arlington Ridge Memorial Park in a subtle but undeniable way, as if the ground itself had shifted from being a place of rest into a map of something unresolved. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker stood quietly between the two disturbed locations, his gaze moving slowly from one point to the other while Rex remained alert at his side, no longer focused on digging, but instead on watching Ethan with a steady, almost expectant calm. Daniel Harper adjusted his flashlight grip, the beam now sweeping wider across the surrounding rows of graves as he tried to understand what pattern, if any, connected what they had uncovered. "If there is another location," Daniel said cautiously, "it would not be marked in any active registry. That would mean someone deliberately removed it from record visibility." Ethan nodded slightly, his expression tightening with controlled focus rather than surprise. "Then we are dealing with more than a missing file," he replied. Rex suddenly turned again, this time moving forward with measured steps toward a second patch of uneven ground approximately 30 yards away, his movement slow but purposeful, as if confirming something rather than searching. Ethan followed immediately, his boots pressing softly into the damp earth as Daniel trailed behind, now fully alert. The second location was less defined than the first, partially obscured by overgrown grass and a slight depression in the terrain that suggested long-term neglect rather than recent disturbance. Rex stopped at its center and lowered his head, not digging yet, but simply standing still as if listening. Ethan knelt beside him, placing one hand on the ground and immediately noticing a subtle difference in density, as though the soil had been compacted unevenly beneath the surface. Daniel moved closer and aimed his flashlight downward. "This area was never officially assigned," he said quietly. "It was marked as administrative overflow during a records transition years ago, then removed entirely from public indexing." Ethan glanced up. "Removed?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Not just archived. Erased from accessible mapping systems. Only physical records would still indicate its existence." A long silence followed, filled only by the distant rustle of trees beyond the cemetery perimeter and the faint hum of streetlights struggling against the night air. Rex finally stepped forward and pressed his nose close to the ground, moving in a slow circular pattern before stopping at a precise point. Ethan watched closely, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folding tool, using it carefully to part the soil layer by layer. As he worked, his expression remained focused but increasingly distant, as if parts of his memory were beginning to align with something he had not fully understood before. Daniel stood slightly behind, observing without interruption now, his earlier skepticism replaced by concern and curiosity. "Sergeant Walker," he said after a moment, "if both sites are connected, then whatever occurred here was likely part of a coordinated administrative action." Ethan paused briefly but did not look up. "Coordinated does not mean authorized," he replied quietly. Rex shifted his position again, stepping closer to Ethan's shoulder, his presence steady and grounding, as if reinforcing the importance of continuing. The soil began to yield small fragments of material, weathered and indistinct, suggesting something had once been deliberately placed here but left without completion. Ethan carefully set each fragment aside on a flat stone, arranging them without fully understanding yet what they represented. The pattern was not yet complete, but it was no longer random. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I have never seen a case where two separate unmarked zones appear within the same section without documentation," he said. Ethan finally looked up, scanning the cemetery once more. "Then it was not meant to be seen," he said simply. Rex let out a low, steady sound, not urgent, but certain. Ethan placed his hand briefly on the dog's back and nodded once, as if acknowledging that whatever they were uncovering was not an accident of time, but something deliberately hidden beneath it. The stillness across Arlington Ridge Memorial Park had deepened even further, as if the night itself had grown heavier with the weight of what was being uncovered beneath its surface. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker stood between the two disturbed locations, his posture steady, but his attention fully divided between Rex and the fragmented evidence spread across the ground. Rex remained unusually calm now, no longer digging, but instead moving in slow measured circles, as if confirming that the pattern he had followed was now complete enough to understand. Daniel Harper stood a few feet away, his flashlight lowered slightly as he processed what little clarity the situation had begun to offer, though uncertainty still dominated his expression. "There is something I need to report," Daniel said quietly after a long pause. "If these areas were intentionally removed from official registry, then we are looking at an administrative breach that would require federal oversight review." Ethan nodded once, though his focus remained on Rex. "Then it will be reviewed," he replied, his voice controlled but distant, as if already preparing for consequences that extended beyond the cemetery. Rex suddenly stopped moving and turned his head sharply toward the northern edge of the grounds, where a narrow maintenance path disappeared between rows of older graves. His posture shifted immediately, alert and fixed, as if something new had drawn his attention. Ethan noticed the change instantly. "What is it?" he asked quietly, stepping closer to the dog. Rex did not respond verbally, but his body language was clear enough to guide them forward. Without hesitation, he began walking along the narrow path, moving with increasing purpose, until they reached a section of the cemetery that appeared older and less maintained, marked by weathered stones and uneven ground. Daniel followed, scanning the area with his flashlight. "This section was scheduled for long-term preservation review," he said. "It has not been actively maintained for years." Rex stopped near a cluster of older headstones and lowered his head again, this time focusing on a single point near the base of one marker that had no visible name, only faint erosion where lettering had once been. Ethan knelt beside him, carefully brushing away loose soil and dried grass. The ground here felt different as well, softer in some places and unnaturally compact in others. Daniel stepped closer, his voice quieter now. That marker was never fully engraved, he said. It was placed during a transitional period when records were being migrated between systems. Some files were lost during that process. Ethan paused for a moment, his hands still in the soil. Lost or removed? He asked. Daniel hesitated. Officially lost. Rex moved forward slightly and pressed his nose to the ground, then stepped back as if indicating a specific depth. Ethan adjusted his position and continued carefully clearing the area, revealing what appeared to be a sealed layer beneath the surface that did not match natural soil composition. It was deliberate, structured, and uniform in a way that suggested human intervention rather than natural settling. Daniel watched silently now, his earlier concern replaced with a growing sense of unease. This is not normal cemetery layering, he said. Ethan nodded without looking up. It was never meant to be discovered casually, he replied. Rex suddenly let out a low, steady sound and stepped back again, his eyes fixed on Ethan rather than the ground. It was not agitation, but confirmation, as if the search had reached a point where instinct alone was no longer leading them. Ethan placed his hand on the exposed section once more, feeling the unnatural uniformity beneath the surface, and for a brief moment, he closed his eyes as fragments of memory surfaced again, not fully formed but enough to suggest that what lay beneath was connected to something far older and more deliberate than a single missing record. When he opened his eyes again, his expression had changed, not to fear, but to recognition that the scope of what Rex had uncovered extended far beyond a single grave or even a single mistake. Daniel exhaled slowly, lowering his flashlight slightly. If there are more locations like this, he said, then this entire section of the cemetery may not be what it appears to be on record. Ethan stood slowly, looking across the rows of graves fading into the darkness. Then we are not looking for something lost, he said quietly. We are looking for something that was never supposed to be found. Rex remained beside him, steady and alert, as if confirming that the path ahead was now clear, even if the truth it led to was still buried just beneath their understanding. The realization that the entire section of Arlington Ridge Memorial Park may have been structured around something deliberately hidden settled over Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker with a quiet intensity that did not require words to feel. The night air remained still, but it no longer felt empty. Instead, it felt layered, as if every row of graves now represented not only memory, but also omission. Rex stood beside him without moving, his posture calm, yet fully alert, as though waiting for the next unseen signal in a pattern only he could interpret. Daniel Harper had stopped speaking altogether, his flashlight angled downward as he carefully absorbed the implications of what they had already uncovered. After a long silence, Daniel finally broke it with a low and cautious voice. If what you are suggesting is correct, Sergeant Walker, then this would mean multiple records were altered across different time periods. Ethan did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the uneven ground ahead, but his attention was no longer on a single location. It was expanding, connecting fragments into something larger than isolated disturbances. Not altered, he said quietly at last. Managed. Rex suddenly lifted his head again, turning sharply toward the eastern boundary of the cemetery, where the terrain dipped slightly toward an older, nearly forgotten section marked by faded stone and untrimmed grass. Without hesitation, he began moving in that direction, faster now, with a sense of urgency that had not been present before. Ethan followed immediately, his pace matching the dog's, while Daniel hurried behind, struggling to keep the flashlight steady as the ground became less even. The air felt different in this section, heavier and less maintained, as if time itself had been allowed to stagnate here longer than elsewhere. Rex stopped abruptly near a cluster of older markers, then turned in a slow circle before fixing his attention on a narrow strip of earth between two unmarked stones. Ethan knelt instantly, placing his hand on the ground, and felt once again that unnatural consistency beneath the surface, not entirely soil, and not entirely stone, but something deliberately layered. Daniel approached cautiously, his voice lower now. This area was part of an expansion project that was never completed, he said. Funding was reallocated, and records were archived without final survey verification. Ethan glanced up briefly. Archived does not mean erased, he replied. Rex stepped forward and gently nudged the ground with his nose, then paused, as if indicating exact placement rather than general location. Ethan began clearing the surface carefully, revealing faint outlines of structured material beneath, suggesting a boundary or enclosure that did not match standard burial construction. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not random disturbance but intentional segmentation of space. Daniel stood slightly back now, watching in silence. I have never seen a layout like this in any official cemetery plan, he said. Ethan continued working slowly, his voice steady but quiet, because it was never meant to be part of one. Rex suddenly stopped moving and looked directly at Ethan, his expression calm but insistent, as if the final confirmation had already been reached. Ethan paused and looked back at him, understanding forming without words. You were not just following scent, Ethan said softly. You were following structure. Rex did not react, but his stillness carried agreement. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly, his earlier certainty replaced with a measured unease. If this entire section is structured differently from official records, he said, then there may be documentation somewhere that explains why. Ethan stood slowly, scanning the surrounding graves that now seemed less like individual markers and more like parts of a concealed system. Or someone made sure there is no documentation left to find, he replied. The wind moved faintly through the trees beyond the cemetery boundary, but here among the older stones, even that movement felt distant. Rex remained beside him, unwavering, as if the next step was already understood. And Ethan realized that whatever lay beneath this ground was no longer a matter of coincidence or memory, but of something carefully constructed and carefully hidden long before they ever arrived. The deeper they moved into the older section of Arlington Ridge Memorial Park, the more the atmosphere seemed to compress into something quieter and more deliberate, as if the cemetery itself was narrowing its focus toward a truth it had long been holding back. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker walked slowly now, no longer reacting to isolated discoveries, but instead observing the pattern that had begun to reveal itself across multiple points in the terrain. Rex stayed slightly ahead, no longer searching randomly, but moving with precise intention, guiding them toward what felt like a final convergence. Daniel Harper followed a few steps behind, his flashlight beam steadier now, but his voice noticeably quieter, as if the weight of what they had already seen had reduced his certainty. This entire layout, Daniel said after a long pause, does not match any known expansion blueprint I have ever been trained on. It feels like sections were added and removed without consistent oversight. Ethan nodded slightly without looking back. Or they were designed to look inconsistent on purpose, he replied. Rex suddenly stopped near a low stone boundary where the ground shifted subtly in elevation, forming a shallow depression that blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding earth. He lowered his head and remained still, not digging, not moving, simply waiting. Ethan approached and knelt beside him, placing his hand on the ground once more, feeling the same unnatural uniformity beneath the surface, but this time it felt more defined, as if layered in deliberate sequence rather than scattered construction. Daniel stepped closer and adjusted his flashlight angle, revealing faint structural edges beneath the soil that suggested a concealed perimeter. This is not a burial zone, Daniel said quietly. This is something built over one. Ethan remained silent for a moment, then carefully began clearing the top layer of soil, revealing a thin metallic edge running in a straight line beneath the surface, partially corroded but clearly intentional in placement. Rex shifted slightly, stepping back just enough to give Ethan space, his gaze still fixed on the exact point being uncovered. The more Ethan revealed, the more apparent it became that this was not a single anomaly, but part of a larger structured system embedded beneath the cemetery grounds. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. If this is infrastructure, then it was never recorded as cemetery expansion at all. Ethan paused, his hand still resting on the exposed edge. Then it was recorded as something else, he said quietly. Rex suddenly turned his head toward the far edge of the section, where the terrain sloped downward into a darker area obscured by taller trees and thicker shadow. Without hesitation, he began walking again, slower this time, but with a clear sense of direction that immediately drew Ethan's attention. Ethan stood and followed, his steps measured, while Daniel hesitated briefly before moving after them. As they advanced, the ground became less uniform, and the air felt slightly cooler, as if the soil itself was changing composition. Rex stopped again at the base of a large oak tree, its roots extending outward in a pattern that partially concealed another uneven patch of earth. He stood motionless, indicating without movement that this was the final point. Ethan looked down, then around, then back at Rex, and for the first time, the full scale of what they were standing over began to settle into place. "This is not just one section," Ethan said quietly. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression tense. "It is connected." Rex remained still, watching Ethan closely, as if confirming that the understanding had finally reached the surface. Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the darkened cemetery around them, realizing that every discovery so far was not separate at all, but part of a single concealed structure that had been waiting beneath their feet, unspoken and unacknowledged, until Rex decided it was time for it to be seen. The night at Arlington Ridge Memorial Park had become almost completely still, as if the entire cemetery was holding its breath in anticipation of a final revelation that had been building beneath the surface for far too long. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker stood at the base of the large oak tree, with Rex positioned directly in front of him, both of them facing the final disturbed section that now felt less like earth and more like a concealed threshold. Daniel Harper remained slightly behind, his flashlight steady but lowered, as though even he was hesitant to break the tension that had settled over the area. Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the ground, tracing the subtle irregularities in the soil that Rex had led them to, each one aligning with the larger pattern they had uncovered earlier. "Everything connects back here," Ethan said quietly, his voice controlled but heavier now. Daniel nodded faintly. "If that is true," he replied, "then this was never random placement. It was a coordinated structure hidden beneath a public cemetery." Rex remained still for a moment longer, then took a single step forward and lowered his head to the exact center of the uneven ground. There was no digging now, no searching motion, only confirmation. Ethan knelt beside him, placing his hand firmly on the ground, and immediately felt the same unnatural layering beneath the surface that he had encountered before, but now it felt more concentrated, as if multiple layers had been built on top of each other over time. Daniel moved closer, his voice almost inaudible. "This would require authorization from multiple levels of administration," he said. "Something of this scale cannot exist without deliberate coordination." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Then someone made sure it did," he replied. Rex suddenly shifted his weight and turned slightly toward Ethan, his posture calm but firm, as if indicating that what they had found was not the end but the confirmation that the end existed. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, then back at the ground, and finally around at the surrounding graves that now felt like surface markers for something far deeper. "You did not bring me here to remember," Ethan said softly, almost to himself. "You brought me here to verify." Rex did not move, but his steady gaze carried recognition. Daniel adjusted his flashlight once more, sweeping it across the base of the oak tree where faint structural lines beneath the soil suggested a hidden boundary extending further than any of them had initially realized. "If this continues beyond this point," Daniel said carefully, "then we are not dealing with isolated sections. We are dealing with a continuous system beneath the entire area." Ethan stood slowly, his expression shifting from analysis to understanding. "A system means design," he said, "and design means intent." The words settled heavily in the air between them. Rex stepped forward again and placed his paw gently on the ground, then looked up at Ethan, holding his gaze with unwavering certainty. In that moment, Ethan understood that the search was no longer about scattered anomalies or missing records, but about a single truth that had been deliberately concealed beneath structure and time. He looked across the darkened cemetery once more, no longer seeing individual graves, but a pattern that stretched beyond visibility. And for the first time since arriving, he realized that what Rex had uncovered was not just hidden ground, but a hidden purpose waiting to be fully revealed.